Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to show you this mountain scene. It's a Bob Ross style of landscape, but this was done in charcoal. So it's a different medium and it requires a slightly different approach and technique. And I'm going to show you how I did it. Let's have a look. The first thing as usual is to work out the composition and decide where all of the elements will be. And I'm just sketching lightly with one of my pencils. My main drawing tools here will be Kohinoor charcoal pencils, and I'm going to use some other blending and erasing tools, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. The size of the paper is about 9 × 12 inches. I'm just using regular 190 GSM drawing paper, and the line of the water is going to be about 1/3 of the height of my paper. We're going to have a mountain in the center of the scene, and the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put down some charcoal powder to cover the sky with it. I'm going to shade the sky with some charcoal powder. Now, why am I doing this, and why am I doing it with charcoal powder? Well, I'm using charcoal powder because it's going to allow for smooth blending, and I'm not going to create any texture. I don't want any lines or spots or things like that. I want the texture to be smooth. So that's the first thing. But why am I doing this in the first place? Why am I adding some value to the sky? Well, obviously, I'm going to draw some clouds in the mountain, and the clouds and the top of the mountain are going to be a lot lighter. They're going to be almost white, and in order for the white elements to show up against the background has to be at least a little bit darker. So just a bit of value here on the sky, and I'm using brushes to spread that charcoal powder and to create a nice even looking tone, which is going to be just a little bit darker at the top and getting a bit lighter at the bottom. Now that I've done that, we're moving on to step 2 or step 3 if you include sketching the composition. I'm going to draw some clouds, and for that I'm going to use a kneaded eraser mostly. A kneaded eraser is an eraser that you can mold into any shape you like, but here I'm trying to create slightly larger shapes, and I'm lifting up a little bit of charcoal, trying to create something that kind of looks like clouds. So you see, unlike Bob Ross's paintings, or any paintings for that matter, I can't really work from dark to light and put some white paint on top of my drawings. I create lighter shapes and lighter values by removing value or by reserving the white space. Here I'm just removing a little bit of charcoal and trying to create some white or lighter shapes. And once I've done working with a kneaded eraser, creating the shapes that I like, I'm refining the edges of those clouds by using a pencil eraser. It's like an eraser in a pencil, which can be sharpened, and it allows you for a little bit more precision. You can draw thinner lines with it. Here I'm using a Faber-Castell pencil eraser, but I normally use a Kohinoor one. I think that one works a little bit better. This one is a little bit harder. Now once I do that, I dab on these shapes a little bit with my finger to create some wispy cloud effects and some smoother transitions, to make it look like some parts of those clouds are a little bit more transparent than others, like they're a little bit thinner than others, or maybe like some of them are a little bit in the shadow while others are a bit lighter. My light source is going to be coming from the left side. That's what I've decided before I started working, and the shadow sides of all of the objects are going to be on the right. You can't really see much of that on the clouds. You can mostly see that the top part of the clouds is a little bit lighter and the top edge of the clouds is a little bit better defined, but that's all we need for now. Just dabbing a little bit with my finger and creating some soft fluffy clouds. So the next step is going to be to start drawing that mountain. Now you see why it was so important for me to shade the background, because not only would the clouds not show up against it, the mountain wouldn't show up either. So we have some mountains in the distance. These are some tall, distant, snow-covered peaks, and the lighter side of them is going to be almost completely white. It's going to be lighter than the background, and I'm starting by removing a little bit of charcoal, again using my kneaded eraser and kneading it into the shapes that I need. So you can see how I already created some shapes here. I created a few peaks, and I can add a few smaller peaks here and there just to make the whole object a little bit more complex and a little bit more interesting. So now that I've defined this lighter side of the mountain, I'm going to move on to the shadow side. The shadow side is going to have a little bit more value, but another thing that I need to do is I need to add a little bit more texture to the mountain. I mean, you can leave it like that, you can make it a lot simpler, like maybe it's all the way in the distance, but sometimes you want to add a little bit more detail. Now when you're doing this, when you're painting, there are some easier ways to do this. With charcoal, I can't really find a quicker and easier way to do this other than just using your charcoal pencil and adding some indications of these darker rocks and darker shapes. Now for the shadow side of the mountain, I'm going to be using vine charcoal. Vine charcoal is very good for shading because it can be easily manipulated. It can be easily lifted up and removed, or you can easily add more value on top of it. So it's easy to decide whether you want to make something a little bit darker or a little bit lighter. And unlike the compressed charcoal in your charcoal pencils, it doesn't really stick to the surface of the paper quite as much. It kind of sits on top of the surface of the paper, and you can move it around more easily with a brush, or you can push it in a little bit harder using tortillas or harder brushes. It's up to you. So here I'm trying to create a little bit more variation in that shadow side of the mountain. I want to create some indications of maybe some cracks and rocks and other shapes to make the surface of the mountain a little bit more interesting. And even in the light side of the mountain, I'm adding some darker details, like maybe there are some rocks in there that are jutting out and maybe aren't covered with snow, and just to make the whole shape a little bit more interesting and to make the mountain a little bit more detailed. So I'm just going to keep refining that using my pencils, my charcoal and tortillas, and when it's done I'm just going to move the brush lightly at the bottom of the mountain and kind of fade the whole shape downwards to create that misty effect around the bottom of the mountain, to make it look like the bottom of the mountain is in the mist and the top of the mountain is up there where the sky, where the air is a little bit clearer and it's getting a little bit more light from above. I also used a pencil eraser. I resharpened it and I used it to define the lighter edges of my mountain a little bit better so that they would stand out in contrast against the background. It's important to have these clean edges when you're trying to explain to the viewer where one object ends and the other one begins. So when you want to explain to the viewer where the object ends and the background begins, you need to have a clean edge. So I'm using a charcoal pencil for the shadow side to emphasize some of these darker edges, and I used a pencil eraser for the light side to emphasize those lighter edges and to create that nice clean edge, because we need to have that clean edge. I'm doing a little bit of refining with my brushes and erasers just to make sure that my mountain looks really nice. And of course you can go on with this for a full hour. It's up to you, but I'm not going to make it quite that detailed. This whole drawing took about, I don't know, maybe a couple of hours. It's not too complex. and it's something that even a beginner can pull off if you follow the instructions. Of course, it does take a little bit of practice because some of these elements of landscapes are a little bit more difficult to draw than others. So like I said, this was meant to be like a Bob Ross type of drawing, like a Bob Ross type of landscape. He was a TV celebrity who inspired many painters, and I also watched a lot of his videos on YouTube. Now I'm going to move on to the foreground, and I'm going to draw some trees. I'm going to draw some coniferous trees, like maybe some tall fir trees here in the foreground. And the main reason why I'm doing that is to make the scene more interesting and to make it look like it has more depth and like you can feel that distance in the drawing. So whenever you're doing landscapes, one of your main goals should be to create that feeling of depth, so that when the viewer looks at your scene, they can feel like some of the objects are much closer to them while others are much further away. And in order to create that effect, you have to arrange your composition in such a manner so that some objects are stacked in front of the others, so that they can kind of push the other elements further back into the distance. Another thing that you can do to achieve that effect is, of course, to control the amount of value and contrast that you're using for the elements in the background and the elements in the foreground, because the stuff in the background is usually going to be a little bit less defined in terms of texture and detail. It's also going to have a little bit less contrast because of the atmospheric effect. When we're looking at something in the distance, it's going to be less defined than the objects in the foreground. With the objects in the foreground, you want to make them a lot more detailed, so you want to use a lot more texture, and you want to use a bit more contrast. So if you create something slightly darker in the foreground, like I'm trying to do now, and you leave something lighter in the background, like that mountain and the sky and the clouds, you're going to create a nice contrast, a nice tension between these two parts of the drawing or painting, whatever it is that you're trying to create. And that contrast is really going to help the viewer, is really going to grab the attention of the viewer, and it's also going to help them get that feeling of distance and depth in your drawing or painting. Now in this step, I'm trying to work out the shape of the landscape or of the ground in the foreground, and I'm going to have some rocks here. I want to make this a little bit more textured and a little bit more detailed than some of the usual Bob Ross type of paintings. So I'm going to be adding some more details, some more rocks and grass here in the foreground. Naturally, when you're working with charcoal, all of this is a little bit slower because you have to use a pencil and you have to draw every single shape. But blending tools and the property of the charcoal that it can be moved around easily helps you a lot with that drawing process. And charcoal, because it's such a messy medium, also allows for those happy accidents where you can just drag your pencil over the paper and you can create some shapes unintentionally, and then you can kind of seize that opportunity and turn them into something you like. And that's one of the things that I like most about charcoal, the fact that with charcoal you have a lot more of those happy accidents than when you do with colored pencil or graphite pencil, because these are much cleaner mediums, they are much more controlled, they allow for more detailed drawings if you use them properly, but at the same time the messiness and the randomness of charcoal allows for a lot of unexpected things that you can use to your advantage to create some interesting looking scenes. Once I defined the darker shapes first, I started working out some of the details, but before that I covered all of the stuff in the foreground with a bit of value, a bit of darker value, using vine charcoal, because I want everything in the foreground to be a bit darker. to have a bit more value. Now naturally I'm going to be working on top of that, and I'm going to be pulling some highlights, and I'm going to be trying to define the three-dimensional shape of these things, but I'll get to that later. For now I'm just trying to figure out what to do with this top part in front of these trees. I'm going to make it look like maybe there are some bushes there, and then I'm going to work on these rocks here. I want to create some irregular looking jagged shapes, but I'm trying to stay consistent with my light source, but at the same time I'm not really sure what the shape of these rocks should be. So this is kind of a process where you make a lot of decisions as you go along. Some of these decisions you need to make them up front. You need to decide where the light source is going to be, where the main elements are going to be. These are the things that you need to decide before you put down the pencil, as it were. But some of these things you can decide as you draw along. For example, how you will shade that rock, what you will put around it, what the exact shapes will be, how much texture you want to put there, how light or how dark you want certain elements to be, or how tall some of these trees will be, whether there will be some grass around these rocks or maybe some bushes. These are some of the things that you can work out a little bit later, and the things that influence those decisions are mostly what's going on during the drawing process. So for example, as I was drawing these rocks here, I decided that I didn't really like the fact that the lower rock was so much lighter than the taller one, than the one above it. So I decided to make it a little bit darker, and I also decided to add a bit of grass in the background to kind of connect those shadow areas a little bit more. And I'm going to do a little bit more of that a bit later. But for now, I decided to do a bit more work on this line of the water at the bottom of the mountain. This is some sort of a lake or a river, it doesn't really matter, some sort of a water surface, which is going to be a bit reflective. And I'm drawing some distant shapes there at the bottom of the mountain. I'm drawing some maybe bushes and trees and things like that on the other shore, on the other bank of the river. and notice how I'm using a lot more blending tools for these objects and how they're a lot less defined. We can see some maybe bushes and canopies of some trees there, but they're a lot less defined than the ones in the foreground, and I'm trying to make them so that they have a lot less texture, so that they're not competing too much with the stuff in the foreground. I'm going to add some trees here at the bottom, and I'm going to make it look like that part of the scene is in front of the mountain, but also at a lot lower altitude than the mountain, and like behind it there is some mist which is kind of obscuring a part of the mountain of the bottom of the mountain. I softened everything with a brush a little bit, added a bit more shadow at the bottom, and I'm moving back to working on these elements in the foreground. So I'm trying to work out what the best looking shapes would be for these rocks in the foreground, and I'm going to be changing my mind a lot. A few more words about Bob Ross. Recently he has been in the news, and there were some kind of disputes between his family and the corporation that owns the right to his shows, to his content. I don't really know much about that. There were even some articles that tried to maybe a little bit smear his name, tell everybody how he wasn't that nice. Well, of course he wasn't. Nobody's that nice, but we all have our nasty and angry moments. But I'm sure that he was a nice person in general. I'm adding some indications of tree trunks here, and trying to work out the grass here in the foreground. I'm going to be adding some indications of grass, first using a bit of vine charcoal for the darker areas or shadow areas in the grass to maybe define those darker clumps of grass. And once I blend that in, I'm going to pull some highlights with a pencil eraser, and to create some lighter blades of grass which are kind of sticking out above those shadow clumps and catching more light from above. So here I worked also a little bit more with a charcoal pencil, and then I did some work with a pencil eraser, adding some lighter shapes and some lighter rocks and some lighter blades of grass. I made this corner in the lower left part of the drawing a little bit darker, and I also added some darker value here around the rocks and on the edge of that bank here to the right, because I wanted to connect that shadow area to make it look like these rocks are casting a shadow, but there's also a bit of shadow because that part of the bank is kind of sloping downwards and facing away from the light source. So it's a good idea to connect shadow areas if you can, because that'll help you bring out the lighter shapes. And you can also notice that I drew some of these rocks on the ground which are sticking out from the grass. I added a bit of shadow under them, and then I drew some lighter shapes on top to make it look like that top part of the rock is catching light. And now the terrain in the foreground is starting to look quite a bit more interesting. As you can see, we have a lot more detail, a lot more contrast, a lot more texture, and that's what I wanted to create, that contrast between the elements in the foreground, which are a lot more detailed, and the elements in the background, which are kind of less defined. I'm going to add some more stuff to the foreground, maybe some fallen dead branches from some of the nearby trees or bushes. So I'm going to draw that with a charcoal pencil, add some random shapes of some branches, and once I drew the shadow side, I'm going to make them a little bit more three-dimensional by adding the light side using a pencil eraser, and maybe a bit of shadow under them to add a bit more depth and a more of a three-dimensional look. I'm trying to rework these trees also a little bit by defining their tree trunks a bit more and adding a few highlights to them. And I'm just going over the whole foreground area with my pencil a bit to add some random texture. I like to do that with a charcoal pencil because it just makes everything a bit more interesting and it creates that illusion of detail. Now there's going to be another piece of land here on the right, which is kind of sticking out or jutting out into that surface of the water. I'm going to draw a whole bunch of bushes there, but I also want some taller trees which will partly obscure that part of the scene on the right. I'm doing this to also to create that feeling of distance, but also to create a bit more balance maybe in my drawing, because I have some trees on the left and I'm going to draw some trees on the right. You don't have to do that, but it's not a bad idea. I used some vine charcoal for the surface of the water here and for the reflections. The reflections are going to be kind of vague. I'm just going to try to reflect the overall amount of value that we can see above the surface of the water. And I use vine charcoal for that because, as I've already explained, vine charcoal is easily manipulated, so you can easily make that reflection a little bit lighter or darker as needed. You can take away a little bit of value by using clean brushes or maybe erasers, or you can add a bit more by putting some more vine charcoal, or maybe just putting down some charcoal pencil, which is even darker. So here I created some indications of reflections under these trees. The surface of the water is kind of reflecting the trees, but I smeared it a little bit and distorted it a little bit because it's the surface of the water. And now I'm drawing the water line using a sharp pencil eraser just to indicate where the water begins, and I'm just drawing some indications of ripples in the water. I'm just cleaning up some of the edges of this bank here in the foreground because that kind of got blurred a little bit as I was working on the surface of the water. And now I'm going to draw a few more trees on the right side using the same technique. I didn't really talk about this much. I first draw a vertical line to give myself an indication about the position of the tree. Some of them are maybe leaning a little bit more to one side than the other. If you want to create an irregular shape, that's up to you. And once I do that, once I establish the height and the overall shape of the tree, I start drawing the canopy. And because these are coniferous trees, I draw these conical shapes with the branches growing out to the side and the trees kind of tapering at the top. And of course, in between these segments or these clusters of needles that form around the branches, there's a little bit of shadow. There's a bit more shadow deeper inside the canopy around the tree trunk. And of course, in between these segments, which are catching light from above, and there's always a bit more shadow under each and every one of them. So you don't have to make it quite as detailed as that, but you know, just as long as you imitate the overall shape of the tree, I think you should be fine. The pencil is going to create a bit of texture on its own anyway, which is a good thing because you can use that to create that illusion of detail. I added a bit more shadow here under this small piece of land which is sticking out on the right, so that I can, not shadow but reflection, to make that reflection a bit more convincing, because the stuff above the water is a bit darker, so the reflection needs to be a bit darker as well. But the middle part of the water is a little bit lighter because it's reflecting that top of the mountain, which is of course a bit lighter. A few more ripples here and there with a pencil eraser, and also some indications of highlights on these bushes here. This takes a bit of patience as I draw some of the lighter foliage on some of these bushes. You can also do that with a kneaded eraser, you can do it with a sharp pencil eraser, it's up to you. Either way, it's going to be a little bit slow and it's going to require a bit of patience. But I can also go back in and add a bit more texture and enhance or strengthen those shadow areas by adding a little bit more value. I'm drawing another tree here, and I like the contrast between the lighter background and the darker trees. It's just that I forgot to cover a little bit of the background. It should be just a little bit darker here on the right. I'm going to fix that eventually. But you can see what my intention here was. I wanted to make it look like this is another bit of land which is sticking out on the right, and it also has some rocks near the water and some bushes and some taller trees growing above them. So right now I'm dabbing a little bit with a kneaded eraser to lift up a bit of charcoal to make those trees a bit more three-dimensional by establishing some contrast between the lighter and darker segments, and the lighter areas and shadow areas. And once I do that, all I'm going to have left is just a couple more trees. I'm also refining this reflection a bit more because I felt that it needed a bit more patches of darker value so that the reflection would be a bit more convincing. The reflections don't need to be perfect because it's just the surface of the water, and it depends on the lighting, it depends on the movement of the water. The image is always going to be distorted a little bit. But what you generally have to do is to try to match the reflection in terms of the overall shape and the amount of value. So as long as you can match the reflection in terms of the amount of value, so that the amount of value in the reflection is kind of similar to the distribution of value in the image above the water, it's going to be fine. It's going to look pretty convincing. I'm going to add another tree here behind these ones, mostly because I messed up that part of the background, so I want to cover it. But I'm finishing this tree here, and I'm going to have one more all the way on the right. I'm just dabbing a little bit with a kneaded eraser again, trying to create some highlights. And at this point I decided to rework the clouds a little bit. I didn't really like the shapes. I mean, sometimes for no reason whatsoever, maybe you just don't like a certain shape and you want to rework it and change its shape a little bit. That's fine. I wanted to change these clouds a little bit. I made a little bit more of a connection between these two clouds on the right and made the one in the middle a little bit lower than the other one, and dabbed a little bit with a brush. Try to create some shapes which are a little bit less regular and a little bit less predictable, I guess. A little bit more randomness is always a good thing when you're drawing landscapes. So I think I like the sky a bit better now. I am removing these bits of tape around the corners one by one to finish those parts of my drawing which haven't been covered with charcoal. And now I'm doing a bit more work on this tree, drawing some indications of a tree trunk, and basically adding a bit more value to this reflection here, because I wanted it to be a bit darker, adding a few more ripples, a few more details to these bushes, and basically wrapping things up, putting down some finishing touches, maybe adding a few more details in the foreground, a few more lighter blades of grass, a few more of these smaller rocks, things like that. This is not really something you have to do, but it's just some of the finishing touches, really. The drawing is finished. I decided to put my signature in the lower right corner, and that's it. I hope you enjoyed the drawing process. If you want to see longer videos, full-length videos, you may want to check out my Patreon. Please check out my other videos on this channel. I'm going to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.